Mr. President,
The senator from Florida.
I ask consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the United States Navy has just released today at 1:30 a record of decision which follows a 2.5-year analysis and final environmental impact statement of 13 alternatives for home porting additional ships at the Naval Station in Mayport, Florida, which is at the mouth of the St. Johns River near Jacksonville. And the Navy's decision will establish a home port for a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier which disperses the fleet instead of it all being in one place in Norfolk, Virginia, a fleet of 5 nuclear aircraft carriers, the most recent of which was just commissioned last weekend, the one that was named after the 41st President of the United States. And those 5 assigned to the Atlantic Fleet, it will disperse that fleet by having a home port for a nuclear aircraft carrier, which will reduce the risk to the Atlantic fleet of carriers from a natural or a man-made disaster. And I want to give a direct quote from the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Installations from his press release today. Quote, "Neither the Navy nor the nation nor its citizens can wait for a catastrophic event to occur before recognizing its responsibility to develop a hedge against such event," a catastrophic event. That's end of quote. The decision is a continuation of what the Secretary of the Navy has said. It is the principle of strategic dispersal. And according to the Secretary of the Navy, and I quote, "Strategic dispersal of our fleet is both a protective measure and a passive deterrence measure, and it is one important factor in the Navy's home porting decisions and its maintenance of its transient piers." Going back to 2005, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Vern Clark, asserted that, quote, "over-centralization of the carrier port structure is not a good strategic move. The Navy should have 2 carrier-capable home ports on each coast." And Mr. President, the fact is there is only 1 carrier-capable port on the East Coast. There are 3 nuclear carrier-capable ports on the West Coast. Now, this wasn't the case before. When we had nuclear carriers and conventional carriers, in the Atlantic Fleet back in the mid-'80s, there were 4 carriers in Norfolk, in this photograph from 1985, and there were 2 aircraft carriers stationed in Florida at Mayport Naval Station. And that was the case all the way up to 1987. And there were still 2 carrier ports all the way up till last year, when the John F. Kennedy, a conventionally powered aircraft carrier, was mothballed, decommissioned and mothballed, and now, with 5 carriers, there's only 1 port. Well, the Navy has been wrestling with this problem, and they have come to the conclusion in the final administrative process of the record of decision announced this afternoon that in the interest of national security, they need these two carrier ports, which we have always had up until last year. If the naval station in Norfolk were to become disabled, the Atlantic fleet carriers would be either stuck in port and prevented from getting to their area of operations, or they would be prevented from reaching a port of maintenance. And mind you, the naval station in Norfolk, Virginia, is 8 miles up the river in a single lane channel that could easily be stopped up. Back in 2007, in our defense authorization bill, we reaffirmed Admiral Clark's judgment that he had made 2 years previously in 2005. We reaffirmed that judgment that the Navy's fleet should disperse its Atlantic coast carriers in 2 home ports, just like it's always been. And the considered judgment and decisions of our military leaders make sense because there are numerous risks that face our nation's capital ships. Those risks are compounded when you put all your eggs in one basket in one place on the East Coast. And remember, on the West Coast, the Pacific Coast, we have not 2, but 3 nuclear home ports, and indeed, you can put in also in an additional 2 ports in the Pacific Theater. So we simply must not delay in implementing this decision. The Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, has come to the same strategic conclusion when he reminds us, and this is from his letter a few weeks ago, and I quote, "Having a single nuclear carrier home port has not been considered acceptable on the West Coast, and it should not be considered acceptable on the East Coast of the United States." End of quote. So it's clear that the strategic necessity is to have 2 home ports for our 5 capital ships, our 5 nuclear aircraft carriers. The lessons of December the 7th, 1941 are a reminder of the danger of our national security if we do not disperse our capital ships. And remember what happened on that day. 8 battleships were in port in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. It was just lucky that the 3 aircraft carriers were out. 2 of them were sailing out to the west to islands like Wake to deliver Marine aircraft, and the 3rd one was 5 hours out of Honolulu doing training exercises. And because there were 8 battleships all bunched up together, the 4-star Navy admiral was fired. He was stripped of 2 of his 4 stars, and he was forced to retire. That is a lesson in Navy history that still stands. And clearly that has been part of the lesson that has led the CNO, the Secretary of the Navy, and the Secretary of Defense to come to this decision, which they announced several weeks ago, and of which that has been officially reiterated today in the record of decision by the U.S. Navy. Now, some people are going to say, well, they won't bunch up the ships. Well, why did they bunch up 5 aircraft carriers in Norfolk in 1997? Count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in 1997. The United States Navy did not learn the lessons of Pearl Harbor then. And you say, well, that's 11 years ago. Well, what about 2001? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And oh, by the way, you see, this is the main bridge. This is the commercial channel, and the commercial channel comes right by all these ships. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all docked together. Mr. President, that was 2001. You say that was 7 years ago. Mr. President, we have information that in 2003, the same thing happened again. I just don't have a photograph of it, but I will. Where are the lessons of Pearl Harbor and the firing and stripping of 2 stars of 4-star Admiral Kimmel from Pearl Harbor in the attack on Pearl Harbor? Where are those lessons being learned by the United States Navy? And I submit to the Senate that that is a main part of the reason of why the United States Navy has today announced the official record of decision that it will disperse the Atlantic fleet of nuclear carriers by having one of those in the port of Mayport, which was the second port until last year. Now, I'll just say that this was studied for 2.5 years. There were 13 alternatives to the risk that exist. The Secretary of the Navy made the decision with the advice of the Chief of Naval Operations and accepted by the Secretary of Defense. Now, it is my hope that parochial politics does not get in the way. There is going to have to be an appropriation of some $500 million in military construction that will make Mayport Station nuclear capable. And of course that's a lot of money, but for the national security of protecting our fleet of our main ships, that is a cost that we're going to have to bear. And it is this senator's hope that we will get the Senate and the House of Representatives to understand the good common sense of this strategic defense policy when it comes around to the Defense Authorization Bill and the Defense Appropriations Bill. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, are we on the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, or is this morning business?
We are post-cloture on S-22, the lands bill.
Thank you. Mr. President, tomorrow it is my understanding that we will be, or sometime in the next period of a day or so, I think we will be on the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, and a number of my colleagues have spoken on the floor today about it. And I would like to talk about that bill because I want there to be a full record before we go forward to vote on a cloture motion on that act. Mr. President, I'm a woman who has experienced gender discrimination. I've experienced it firsthand. I know how hard it can be to deal with for a woman or any person who has a discrimination for any reason in the workplace. I'm pleased that we are going to address this issue. I think it is very important that we have all of the considerations around this bill as we go forward so that we do not have unintended consequences. I have been a small business owner. I know the importance of clarity, of knowing if you have made a mistake or a potential mistake, or if you are accused of making a mistake, and the liability that might go along with that. I think it is important that we recognize that this is not just a woman's issue, it's an issue for every person, whether it is age discrimination or